That's it. This is the word of the Lord.
As I explained, I felt a little bit under the assessment gaze myself this week, as people have looked deep into my eyes and listened to my words and wondered, are you really the man for the job? I think as we go through life, we're constantly evaluating people. We want to work out who we can trust, who might be worthy of our entrusting ourselves to them. After a false start with King Saul, Samuel was anxious that an appropriate successor be chosen to be good king over the people Israel. And this is that story of how that happened. I guess different people look for different things when it comes to selecting a leader. Part of it might depend on the task at hand, the particular skill set that might prove to be most helpful. Beyond skill set, we look at a person's character, for example, the way they conduct themselves in real world situations. That tells us a good deal about how they might perform as a leader. We get a sense of who they are. If you've got the stomach for such things and you haven't already seen the series of documentaries the ABC produced on our last 5 prime ministers, it's well worth a look. The first series on the Labor government is called The Killing Season, very aptly named, and the second series on the Conservative government is called Nemesis, also very appropriately named. They reveal a lot, both about what the electorate was looking for in political leadership and the types of characters our democratic system produces in response. But quite honestly, I can see no better political system than democracy. But it becomes really clear that the way people are formed and educated has a huge impact on the way democracy functions. Something we've got to think about as we go forward. Saul was an obvious choice for Israel's king. If you're looking for someone to lead the people in battle, you could not look past Saul. That may actually have been literally true, because he was one huge fella, apparently. Saul was a decisive commander. He rallied the people and they came together to fight their common enemies. As it says in Samuel 10, when he, Saul, stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upwards. He literally stood head and shoulders above everybody else. Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among the people." So all the people shouted and said, "Long live the king!" That was about Saul. And Saul enjoyed some early and very decisive victories when he went into battle. He quickly won over the naysayers, and all the people from each of the 12 tribes responded to Saul's call to arms. At last, Israel looked like a coordinated fighting force, and they had the king they were looking for. And we should pause for a moment to let that sink in. God gave the people just what they were looking for and crying out for. God knew it was not going to end particularly well for them, and nonetheless, God honoured the desires of the people. The people were also clearly very pleased with being given Saul as their king. The whole thing appeared to be working pretty much as the people had hoped that it would. The tribes of Israel were able to fight back, beating off those who came against them, attacking them, and doing so on equal terms with them. In short, the people had wanted to be more like their neighbours, and they became just like their neighbours. And sadly, this was a repudiation of Israel's true calling. It had not yet fully sunk in for them or been articulated as clearly as it would be in the future, but in due course Isaiah would spell it out. He'd say, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the people, but the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear upon you, and nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Now, the surrounding nations would never be attracted to the light if Israel were effectively just the same as everybody else. What would be the point in that? It would be on account of Israel being quite different that they would be attractive. Israel's attraction would be as those people who lived in response to the living God, as a faithful expression of what it meant to be God's people. Saul, however, got a little carried away with the winning battle kind of thing. And to my mind, this is perfectly understandable. We all prefer to lean towards our strengths, and warfare was Saul's clear strength. It turned out that the thing that Saul was not quite so good at was waiting on God. So Saul was so anxious at one point to get into battle that he was waiting for Samuel to come and arrive and offer the appropriate sacrifices so that the army could receive the blessing of God. And Samuel was nowhere to be seen, and some of Israel's fighting force were making the decision that it was dinner time and they'd go home. And instead of hanging around for Samuel's blessing, Saul took matters into his own hands. He went ahead and offered the sacrifice himself, even though he was not a priest. He had never been a priest, and as far as we can tell, he had little understanding of what a priest was or how to behave as a priest. Saul decided it was entirely appropriate under the circumstances that he should assume the responsibilities of a priest. If you want to read that story, it's in 1 Samuel chapter 13. Have a look at that. In our world today, it's easy for us to miss the gravity of this era of judgment. However, in Saul's day, the sacred and the non-sacred were kept carefully, deliberately, and resolutely apart from each other. The idea of holy has at its root meaning being separate, being different from, not common. Holy is expressly not the usual or the everyday. So Saul stepping up and stepping into the realm of the holy was broadly understood to be a big no-no. It displays a certain arrogance in regard to the things of God. There's an absence of appropriate respect and awe. See, for Saul, the battle was the only arena that really mattered, and winning was all important, and the God stuff was kind of merely in service to that greater end. So Saul felt utterly justified and entitled, and the people, for their part, were inclined to agree with Saul. After all, what's the point of having a God if that God doesn't help you win when you go into battle, right? Saul and the people had completely missed the point. They had failed to perceive the reason for their existence as a nation was completely different to all the other nations. Israel just wanted to win, and Saul wanted to win for the sake of winning, it seemed. That was not why God had called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was not why God had delivered them from slavery and oppression. It wasn't why he'd led them into the land. Israel was fast becoming the very image of those who had formerly oppressed them. We read in Samuel 13, 1 Samuel 13, Samuel says to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over the people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." King Saul would have to go. God tells Samuel to go and anoint Saul's successor, and Samuel is quite rightly nervous about this idea. To go and anoint the successor to the king while the king is still alive is effectively saying the exact opposite of "long live the king." It's really saying God is done with this current king and we're looking for the next. Thank you very much. Samuel wanted to be obedient, and he wanted to avoid being killed by Saul. So God guides Samuel in a kind of misdirection. Make it look like you're going to offer a regular sacrifice. That's what a priest does all the time. No one's going to blink an eye about that. Invite the locals along. Make sure Jesse and his boys are also invited. God directs Samuel to select one of Jesse's 8 sons to be Saul's successor. The first son is tall, strapping, a really nice, reminiscent of Saul kind of fellow. And he stood head and shoulders above his peers as well. And Samuel immediately assumes this is the one God has chosen. I think he'd learned his lesson, right? But God has a very different criteria for assessing who would make an appropriate king. It's not about a person's physical size or indeed their ability with a sword. It's not related to their capacity to dominate or how intimidating they appear to be. These very physical attributes are easily recognised, and our instincts are honed to quickly detect and identify what they mean. That's somebody you don't want to tangle with. But how do we know another's heart? Indeed, how do we know our own heart? It's not straightforward to read our own motives and intentions, because we have competing interests in this regard. We, all of us, I think, both want to appear to do that which is right and good for our tribe, and we also primarily want to survive. And these two objectives rarely align perfectly. And in the gaps, we have this well-developed capacity to fudge the data and the story that we're telling ourselves about ourselves. We overlook certain details and we play up certain other details. And to avoid being absolutely delusional, we usually base most of this adjusted narrative on some of the facts, just not all of them. However, we assemble the facts that we choose in ways that paint us in a way we prefer to be seen, rather than as a more objective observer might view us. And this makes it tricky to know one's own heart, so we naturally lie to ourselves. It makes it very difficult to know anyone else's heart as well, because they are so convincingly portraying themselves as the person they've persuaded themselves that they are. And Jeremiah goes so far as to say, the heart is more deceitful than all else and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So the best way to get an accurate read on someone's heart, your own or anybody else's, is to observe behaviour over a long duration of time. Subterfuge is relatively easy to pull off over a limited period. We can all put on our best behaviour for a short duration for a particular event. I think I remember when going out with young women, I could look pretty good for about an hour and a half, on a date, that kind of thing. But actually, way back then, 45 years ago, and I know the whole dating scene has changed in this period, but someone gave me some excellent advice about finding a partner. They said, go out in a group with the people that you like. See how they behave with each other. Don't do this just once, but do it as a regular habit. You'll soon see who are the caring people and who are the ones who are self-absorbed and just caught up with themselves. It's really good advice. I don't know if you can still do that these days, but it is good advice. Young people, if you want to get the clearest idea of your heart, observe the way you have lived, not just over the past hour or so, or even merely the past week or the past year. How have you spent your time and resources? In what have you invested your life? What has been the impact of your presence in the world? How have you contributed to your community? Our God reads our hearts over the longest view. Again in Jeremiah, I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give to each person according to their ways, according to the results of their deeds. Why look at the heart at all, though? What does it matter what's going on in the heart if the person is effectively getting a particular job done? Surely it would be more efficient to simply assemble a team who are excellent at doing the task that you want to achieve. And that might actually be true in some circumstances, but God is not seeking to get a job done or to achieve a particular task. God is interested in ongoing and ever-deepening relationship. It's not a job or a task, any more than you could say marriage could be seen in those terms. Heart is difficult to quantify, but it suggests potential as well as what has already been realised. When we enter into any relationship with another person, we know that relationship will not always remain the same. We are constantly changing. They are also constantly changing, not to mention that our circumstances are constantly changing as well. Relationships either grow and accommodate these changes, marvelling at the new discoveries all along the way and enjoying entering into those new places, or they get stretched to breaking. When we look at the heart, we're looking to assess the growing potential. Are there signs of willingness to expand, to continue to care? As the wedding vows make quite explicit, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, whatever the future holds. That's big stuff. Looking at the heart is a way of getting a sense of trajectory. Where are we likely to end up together? Not in the particularities of a future circumstance, but in the nature of our relationship as it grows. Do we want the same basic things? Will we be good for each other? Is this relationship going in a direction that we're both going to be glad of? And I see that as what God is looking for in the next king of Israel. Saul was a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield, but God is not primarily interested in battle. You might even say Saul's main strength, his military prowess, became the main source of his ruin in relation to God. Saul wanted God to be in service to his military goals. Saul never quite understood that everything in Israel was designed to be in service to God, not him. That's why Saul's successor could not be just like Saul. Something else had to be more important. It was all about the heart. The primary distinction that God makes between Saul and the one who succeeds him is that Samuel declares God has chosen a man after God's own heart. That's in 1 Samuel 13:14, which is to say the single most important thing for this chosen one will be to be pleasing in the sight of God, to bring delight to God's heart. Now, being victorious in battle might be important, but if it is important, then the victory is important in that it is pleasing to God, not in that it is a victory in and of itself per se. Saul's primary commitment was to his status as a warrior king, even beyond his concern for the people, because he enlisted them on his agenda. Saul was committed to winning the battle above all else, and Saul enlisted the people and even God to achieve that desired end. And God, on the other hand, was looking for a king who would stay true to God's own heart. In the first few years of my Christian discipleship, I had a very structured spiritual discipline. I read the Bible every day. I read a short passage. I read a little notebook that had some thought-provoking questions about the text. I wrote in my journal some things, and I would say a prayer. I prayed about a whole bunch of things. And I always concluded my prayer with these 4 or 5 things. Lord, grant me humility, wisdom, courage, which was sometimes faith or boldness, but most of all, a heart after you. See, humility, wisdom and courage are all well worth having, but none of them matter without the heart after God. And a heart after God will always lead you toward humility, wisdom and courage, or faith, whatever you want to call it, every time. This story of Samuel anointing David offers important background to the eventual arrival of Messiah. Not only is Messiah in the hereditary line of David, Messiah is in the spiritual line of David as one completely faithful to God's own heart. If you want to train your own heart to be a heart after God, you will find no better model than Jesus. It was said of Jesus, or did he say it himself? I can't remember. He said it himself. My food and drink is to do the will of the one who sent me. Jesus is God's chosen eternal King. He doesn't battle against flesh and blood, but against the powers and the principalities in this confusing age. Messiah engages this battle both by exposing the realities of our hearts and offering us an alternative orientation to set our hearts towards. Jesus demonstrated his heart after his Father, and then he calls us unequivocally to follow him in his way. And that's what we should do. Let us pray. Lord, the matters of the heart are tricky for us because we find it difficult to be really transparent and honest about who we are and then to see who others are. You don't suffer in the same way in that regard, and you see us for precisely who we are. Help us to see more clearly and help us to follow one who can give us a clear heart and follow you and do the things that are on your heart to the glory of your name. Amen.